Bitter bile rose in my throat as I thought back on how the warden had laughed as he removed the chains from my wrist. You aren't even worth a bullet. Go, boy. Do not come back until you have something to prove your worth. Then he shoved me into the dirt and slammed the gate of the compound behind me. It had been an order of execution in all but name. Never mind finding any treasure, simply surviving out in the desert would be challenge enough. That had been the first obstacle: surviving. The warden cast me from the compound with only a leather backpack filled with a canteen of water, a dagger, and the clothes on my back. It's the least I could give you, he scoffed when he pushed the backpack into my hands. I wandered through the heat of the desert, aimlessly. In half an hour, I sweated through my clothes. By noon, I'd emptied my entire water container. I'd collapsed on the ground by the time the sun had disappeared over the horizon. As I lay in the dirt, my lips cracked and dusty, I wondered how I would die. Would I freeze to death in the night? Or, worse, would a sand snake come and devour me? Would raiders come and abduct me? Or would dehydration and starvation take me? I shivered as the cold wind of the desert blew over me. I lifted myself up and dug my hands into the sand. One of the few things I'd learned from the compound was that burying oneself in sand could help with staving off the worst of the cold in the desert. I figured it could help me survive the night at least. That would be enough until I could figure something else out. I was elbow deep in the dune when my fingers scraped on something hard and metallic. What was that? I wondered. Maybe I'd stumbled upon some sword one of the compound guardsmen dropped on the patrol. I dug deeper, pushing more sand out of the way in messy piles. With a grunt, I unearthed a brown board, made of a brown metal I was not familiar with. However, I did recognize what the device was. It was a glider, probably lost from one of the warden's scouts while out looking for material. I remembered watching the scouts float on them, circling around the top of the compound like vultures. I'd always wondered what it felt like to be so high up in the air. I'd wanted one for myself, but I knew I would never get that opportunity. The scouts would talk as they drank fermented cactus juice. They found the gliders in the ruins, along with other weapons and guns that they used from day to day. Most of their spoils had belonged to long-dead races that used them in the time before for surviving and navigating in the deserts. It was almost unbelievable that I had one before me. Maybe it still works, I mumbled to myself, half crazed at the desperate hope. I crawled closer to the glider, taking a better look at the thing. It was smaller than I remembered, barely spanning my stretched arms. There were no switches, knobs, or buttons anywhere on the surface of the contraption indicating where it could be turned on. However, on one side of it were a line of 3 small circles. The circles didn't respond in any way to my touch. I even tried biting one. Nothing worked. It was probably broken beyond repair. In anger, I threw the damn thing into the ground. What was I expecting to happen? Why did I think some old piece of tech would magically start working for me? I thought it could save me. But as soon as my foot touched the smooth surface of the glider, it leapt to life, catapulting forward into one of the piles of sand I built up. I stared at the thing, my mouth agape. I approached the glider again, slowly. It still looked as immobile as stone. What had triggered this response? I wondered as I pulled the glider from the dirt pile and laid it back down on the ground. I raised my foot again, this time putting the toe of my boot down on the glider's surface. The effect was immediate. The circles, thrusters, I realized, sprang to life. An invisible force belched from the glider, springing the glider half a foot into the air and displacing the sand beneath it. I stared incredulously. "Will you let me stand on you?" I asked the thing, fully aware of its inanimate, but I figured I'd still ask anyway to be safe. I rested the rest of my foot on it as if it were made of glass instead of metal. When it didn't shoot out from under me or burst into flames, I allowed myself to exhale. Then, with just as much caution, I put my other foot on the glider. I allowed a sense of relief and satisfaction to wash over me as I balanced on the board, but I pushed it out of my mind before long. I needed to get it moving. Otherwise, I'd be no better than if I never dug it out from the sand in the first place. However, my worries were soon put to rest. The glider lurched forward with such force I nearly lost balance. The board carried me forward as quickly as it could, throwing up peels of sand as I traveled. I panicked at first, but before long, I caught my balance and leaned forward. I hooted, exhilarated, to feel the wind in my face as I sped over the sand dunes. Just for that minute, I allowed myself to forget it all. I just relaxed and soaked in everything. The simple pleasure of flying, of feeling the wind in my face and the sand spreading from around me. It was enough to make me almost forget about the exile. Almost. When the thrill of the flight began to subside, I slowed the glider to a float and pondered my next steps. What was I going to do next? For the first time since I entered the desert, I considered the possibility of surviving. I suppose the heady freedom that mobility allowed me gave me that hope. Maybe, just maybe, my options were a little more flexible than laying down and dying. Perhaps I could run away. I could easily abscond with the glider and never lay eyes on the compound or this blasted desert again. I could go away and never come back. It was appealing to think about, particularly because it would have been so easy. No one would have come looking for me. However, I soon let go of that fancy for the simple fact that I didn't know how far the desert stretched. The sand dunes extended far beyond my line of sight. Even with the glider, it may have taken me several days or even weeks to get out. Even if I did manage to get away, what then? The only places I knew about besides the compound belonged to the wild-eyed raiders, who would often attack the compound in attempts to take land from us. They threw themselves into the warden's guns with an almost religious zeal, fearless in the face of certain death. If they were willing to do that to themselves, I didn't want to imagine what they would do if they found me. I only had one real choice. I needed to go to the ruins. A few miles north of the gate of the compound, past an oasis, were the ruins of the old civilization. It was there where the warden scavenged for our supplies. I had heard the scouts whispering about it and the treasures they had found there. Not only was it filled with all kinds of technology, but even gold and diamonds could be found within. One scout had even brought back a diamond the size of an egg. Perhaps, I thought, I could find the ruins and bring something worthwhile back. Then maybe they would allow me to return. But before any of that, I needed to find something to eat and drink. I hadn't eaten since I had been put out of the compound. I put my hand on my complaining stomach. If I didn't find something soon, I would pass out. I coasted forward on my glider, flying only in a straight line. I didn't know where I was going exactly or what I was looking for. Perhaps I could find a cactus or an indigenous creature hiding in the sand. However, I did not have to travel far before I saw the oasis. I had never laid eyes on one before and nearly cried out in joy at the beauty of it. It was small, only able to support a small pool of water and a few windswept trees that stood defiantly in the sand. The water was as blue and clear as the sky, reflecting the sun back at me. I nearly jumped in the water in my zeal. I stumbled off my glider and stuck my face into the cool water. I drank deeply from the clean water, soothing my cracked skin and dry throat. When I had my fill, I fell back, gasping for air. I half crawled and half dragged myself beneath the shadiest tree, furthest from the water's edge, and breathed a sigh of relief as I closed my eyes. How long had it been since I slept? I wondered. Certainly not since I had left the compound. I sighed again as I relaxed for the first time in so long. Who are you? A voice rang out from above me, jolting me like I had been struck. The girl had appeared before me near the edge of the water. She seemed to have come from nowhere, like she materialized out of the sand. She wore loose-fitting robes that shielded her from the worst of the sun, and she pointed a bow at me. but it was somewhat less intimidating because there was no arrow knocked. There wasn't even a string to knock the arrow in. "Who are you?" she repeated again, her voice in an accent I did not recognize. "Jack," I answered, holding my hands in the air. Despite the apparent uselessness of the bow, at an instinctual level, I knew that it was far more dangerous than it looked. The girl could have killed me at any time. "Jacques," she repeated, rolling my name in her mouth like it was a strange word she'd never heard before. "That is not a raider name. What are you after?" However, before I answered, she caught sight of the glider left in the sand. Her expression immediately became hostile. She roared words in a language I did not recognize. "Traitor!" she bellowed in English. "You are one of the sons of Rock. I will give you the death you deserve, you dog." The bow responded to her rage, a faint blue glow emanating from it. The light shone brighter and brighter until it was almost blinding. "I'm not a traitor," I said. "I don't even know who you are." "I will not listen to your lies," she said. "Now die." She put her free hand on her other hand and slid her fingers back, up her arm. A glowing bolt appeared on her arm. Blue light reflected off her hard eyes as she loosed the glowing arrow.